and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms Conservation webinar. I'm Matt Helmers here at Iowa State University, the Department of Ag and Biosystems Engineering, and Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and faculty member that is fortunate enough to be involved with the Iowa Learning Farms. And welcome to everybody. I hope you're having a great week. And we have a great speaker lined up today, Dr. Mark Licht, who is an Extension Cropping Systems Specialist in the Department of Agronomy here at Iowa State University, is going to talk about redefining the field edge case study. So this kind of follows on with some of the other case studies that Mark and Kay and Adam and myself have talked about. So as always, if you have questions, feel free to type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Dr. Licht at the end of his talk. But with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, so you kind of stole my first slide. I was going to point out, that we had done this, and it's the fourth in a series, right? And so, yeah, January 12th, December 8th, and August 25th were the other ones that Matt, Kay, and Adam, and then myself had presented. So this, this is part of a larger effort. So by all means, jump on the Iowa Learning Farms website if you missed those other ones, and they do have them pre-recorded, so you can or posted those recordings, so you can jump back and you can find those. So yeah, it's great to be here today, and I'm glad to see some familiar faces or familiar names, I should say, as well. So as we think about this particular one, we're focusing in on kind of that redefining the field edge aspect of conservation. And so this case study, like the other case studies that we've presented on this webinar series, it has different booklets or different materials designed for the educators, for the students, and then there's some additional information for the students. And so I do want to point that out, that those are available online, and I'll put up a website where you can find not only from this case study, but all the case studies, these materials. Okay, so there's different materials out there. And then the other thing in my approach today is I'm actually using not all, but a good chunk of a slide set that was developed for instructors with this. And so I'll point that out now, just because, especially if Ann and Liz and Jackie are watching, they're going to notice and recognize some of these slides very closely. But that's one of the nice resources that we have with these case studies, is that we do provide some of the PowerPoint materials. Before I really jump deep into this, I do want to give credit to our funding sources. So obviously this is a joint project with Iowa State University, Extension in particular, but some others as well. The conservation case study series was funded through USDA NRCS partnership grant there. And so we have a number of different partners and aspects to that project, but one of the outcomes was these 4 different case studies. And then more related to this particular case study, this was funded through a research and demonstration grant with the North Central Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education grant program. And so this one will have a few additional resources that maybe the others did not. And I'll highlight some of those as we go through here a little bit. But just really want to recognize that this wasn't just Iowa State University working in a vacuum. There was a number of different groups that were involved with us and a couple different funding sources. So as we think about this redefining the field edge, part of this is really looking at it from a watershed-based conservation case study. So yes, we do highlight some individual farms and fields, but this really does come back to that whole watershed and where do we place things, and I'll allude to that a little bit more. This one, like the others, we have some real world decision tools and resources. That's what really makes these case studies strong and relatable. This one in particular, we do talk a lot about evaluating the costs and benefits, the profit loss of row crop fields, and how we can maybe do things a little bit differently to increase overall profitability, minimizing the risk from some of that marginal land where we may not always find profits. Okay, and so we're really looking at, trying to make much more better informed management decisions. So this one here, this case study in particular, was based off of looking at marginal areas in central and north central Iowa, and most of those marginal areas tend to be those consistently wet, low yielding areas of the field. So as you can see in this picture, you can kind of see the fence posts there. This is an area that there's a stream that cuts through it, and as it goes out of its banks, we flood up onto that row crop land. Some of that flooding, ponding can stay there for 7 to 10 to 14 days, depending on kind of what the rainfall pattern is, what the soil moisture is, right? And so, we're really focusing in on those particular areas in this case study. This does translate outside of the north central Iowa prairie pothole region. We may be talking about eroded areas that are degraded. We may be talking about side hills that have an erosion resource concern, but may also have side hill seeps that reduce stands and yield potential there too. So there's other areas that these become applicable in. We're just focused, kind of on those pothole areas, those low wet areas in this case study. So again, kind of that marginal farmland, so difficult areas to grow row crops, right? And a lot of times what we're focused on, particularly with this, is where those low profit, difficult marginal row crop areas are that are adjacent to kind of that existing field margin, right? So a lot of times we talk about planting fence row to fence row. We may be trying to shift that mentality of, well, maybe there's these potholes that are 1 acre or 2 acres in size that run alongside of or run into that fence line. And so we may not be getting our row crop productivity there, but we've put in the cost of production. And so that leads us to be able to really look at the profit loss of these areas, and then can spur the thought of, do we take these out of row crop production and put them into some sort of a perennial species? And in our project with the North Central SARE, we were taking them out of row crop production and putting them into a CP23 mix that was suitable for these wet and flooded areas. Again, I think this is an opportunity where we can, again, talk about converting marginal land into those conservation areas, but it also allows us to start talking about what is the multi-year progression of things, evaluating not only where you're at now, but, in the past 5-10 years, but then also how would things look if you move forward 5-10 years into a different program or a different species in some of these areas. It allows us to think about some of the individual motivations or unique challenges that some of these areas and farmers may have. And so I think there's a lot of benefit to acknowledging that we're not necessarily thinking, 100% from the row crop perspective, but we are thinking much more holistically, across the entire landscape. So one of the approaches that we take in this case study is really looking at kind of the benefits to the landowner. And so again, from a holistic, line of thinking, if you're in a landowner tenant type situation, now you have to start balancing, what is the rental fee, that cost per acre on the tillable acres, that's on the landowner's, side of it, as well as the tenant. But then the tenant has the cost of production, right? Those input costs. And so, this is one of those things where, the art is in the deal, so to speak, in that, it may make sense to negotiate taking some land out of row crop production, putting it into a perennial species, and then rebalancing the cash rent to account for that. And so there could be some trade-offs that occur there, right? But again, it's going to be a different situation if it is a farmer landowner where it's one and the same. They have different motivations. They can do things a little bit differently. because not only are they the landowner, but they're farming it themselves. And so sometimes that makes it easier to do some of these conservation practices like this. And then obviously, something like this, we do start to talk about what are some of the conservation, the benefits that we may see into the watershed. And so there's some improvements in water quality, there's some things with soil health, and then obviously we have, especially if we're into some of those more native species, there's some of the wildlife benefits that can be attached to this type of a row crop conversion into a perennial. And so as we think about that, now we really have to start thinking about what does it mean from an entire watershed scale, right? Because we could potentially be seeing these as treating water before it's moving downstream, right? And so thinking not just about what's happening on our land or an individual piece of land, but how does it fit into the local watershed scale versus how does it scale up into the much larger watershed. And so that's where I'm bringing in here this nutrient reduction strategy, right? So we do have a commitment to conservation. We're talking about science-based voluntary approach, and we know that we have targets, right? So from a non-point source pollution, we're trying to reduce nitrogen by nitrogen loss or loading by 41%, and that phosphorus loss by 29%. And this all ties back into the Gulf of Mexico hypoxia action plan, right? So something that we're doing maybe at a local watershed scale or a local field scale, if we get enough adoption of it, now all of a sudden we're moving toward impacts and maybe some significant impacts out on that entire watershed scale. So a lot of times we talk about in-field practices, so something like no tillage or cover crop usage, or we flip and we talk about edge of field practices, so the saturated buffers, the bioreactors, the wetlands, those types of things, right? But what we're talking about here is, converting row crop to, that perennial, right? So yes, it could maybe fall into that edge of field, but yet we're still in, so to speak, the field boundaries. And so it doesn't necessarily fit either of those real well. And so maybe, that's where this redefining terminology really is coming from. It lets us rethink those boundaries, rethink, the field areas that we're farming or not farming from a row crop perspective. And so they do fit a little bit differently in that thought process because there is some of that land use change that's occurring, but yet we're getting some of the benefits in field as well. So some of the benefits that we might see, we're going to be slowing down runoff. We're going to be capturing sediment and nutrients because of that runoff being slowed down. Obviously, these perennial species are taking up plant nutrients, not just during our typical, row crop growing season, but they're growing, they're green, they're actively taking up nutrients, both in the spring and the fall when those corn and soybean crops would not be. And so then that leads us to having some of those benefits of increased organic matter and infiltration, obviously in the footprint of those perennials, but because that improved infiltration and organic matter, now we might be able to see some of the, I'll say the border area, whether it be row crop or perennial, that now all of a sudden have better infiltration, or it may even improve some of the productivity kind of on the edge of those pothole areas or those wet areas. So the other thing to again, I keep mentioning it, right, is the critical impact that we can have on some wildlife. And so there are a couple slides in here that really do talk about the wildlife action plan, species of greatest conservation need, right? And so we can use these to proactively help us with some wildlife, can help us potentially providing some pollinator habitat, some monarch habitat, things like that. And so you can jump into, not only talking about, the row crop aspects, but you can jump into the conservation and the wildlife aspects of practices of this type. I do want to point out, and I think this is a good place to do it, that we do have various resources. And so I'm pointing out this whole farm conservation best practices manual because it does have a section in there on prairie strips and taking out some of these marginal areas to be able to help with conservation and field profitability, field use overall. And so if this is a practice that you're really wanting to learn more about, jump into this manual and it starts to give you some of those pointers and some of those easy entry points to work from. Okay, so the next couple slides here, I'm just illustrating some of the additional resources that are available. And so if this is being used for high school students, or if it's being used maybe in an undergraduate classroom, you may want these definitions to help get the students up to speed and know kind of what we're talking about with some of the terminology. Even if you're using it at maybe a graduate level course, or as you're working with farmers or landowners, you still might want these definitions as a way of making sure that everyone's kind of on the same playing field, has the same understanding of what we're talking about there. This case study does have a farm in detail, and so this particular farm, as you can see there, it has a stream that's had portions of it straightened out along the east and south side of that field, highlighting also again the soil types that we have, the number of acres and some of the slopes there. This is in the Clarion Nicollet Webster Soil Association. And so we have a lot of clay loam and loamy type soils. And then with this case study, because again, we're talking about identifying marginal areas that may have more loss than profit, we do have profit loss maps. And so I'm just showing 2 of the years. I believe with this one, I think we have 5 to 8 years actually with it. And so you can flip through and you can see not only the year, but which crop it was. And then you can start to see, which areas of that field are more susceptible to the loss side versus the profit side. Now, obviously, one of the main drivers of profit loss is going to be that commodity price. And so you will see that reflected here as well as you go from one year to the next. If we just look at that 2018 year, kind of in the southwest area, there's that reddish colored triangle, right? And so this is an area of the field that does get some ponding up along that south fence line. But then as you look closer toward the top of the triangle, there's actually water that's being diverted into it. And so there's an erosion resource concern there that is affecting soybean yields and corn yields in certain years. And then over on that southeast corner, again, in the soybean year, you can really see it. If you extrapolate out where the edge of the field should be versus what was actually harvested, you have field areas, 3 little field areas there that did not get harvested because there was nothing to harvest. So we'd had enough flooding for long enough that it impacted the crop stand to the point where there was nothing to harvest, right? And so you can start to identify these, and if you look at the pattern over a 5 to 10 year period, all of a sudden you can really pull these out quite easily. With this particular farm, one of the easy things to note was that a lot of times we had the lost yield in these 2 areas in the soybean year, but in the corn year, a lot of times they were profitable or they're kind of in that low profit area. And so again, there's some differences that come about because of the precipitation, the weather year we have, and then there's some differences because of corn versus soybean crop year as well. Along with this, we have practice and details, right? So we talk about the practices a little bit more, have materials that dive in a little bit deeper, and some resources that you can go and jump into to find more information yet. And so those are kind of nice to be able to have. With this case study in particular, and because of the North Central SARE project, myself and Adam Janke had jumped out and did vegetation assessments. And so we did July and October vegetation assessments. And this was in the second year of establishment. And so those darker orange areas, and then the kind of the darker olive color, those are two weedy species, right? So they're going to be our annual weeds. And then the more of the salmon color and the tan yellowish color, those are our perennial species that we seeded in. And so even in the second year, you can see that there's just not a lot of the desirable species that we were aiming for. But it just goes to highlight that it does take a little bit of time to get these CP23, these mixes, native mixed species, to establish. And so our expectations need to be tempered to kind of match, what we're going to see out there, right? It's not going to be like a corn crop where, 4 weeks after planting, you can see the nice healthy plants growing, and then you can see that progression, right? It's going to be a much longer establishment progression for some of these perennial species. Again, because of the North Central SARE program, we were able to go out and we took monthly soil nitrate samples in the areas that we converted to the vegetation, perennial vegetation, but then also in a paired comparison site, so similar soil type, landscape position in the corn and soybean fields around them. And so the top table there is just a comparison between the perennial and the soybean. And so obviously these soybeans, we did not apply any nitrogen to, but you can see that June through October, the perennial had a lower soil nitrate level than those soybeans, right? And again, if you just compare the soybeans there in that top figure with corn down in the bottom figure, again, you can see quite a difference in the soil nitrate levels just because of the individual crop, right? So with corn, we're out there fertilizing it because that's where we attain our corn productivity from, or partially anyhow, right? But then again, when you compare it with the vegetation of those perennial species that are not fertilized, and they're really taking up the mineralized soil nitrogen, very, very stark differences between the soil nitrates of the perennial versus the corn, right? So that corn soil nitrates peaking around 30 to 35 parts per million in May, June. By July and August, corn nitrogen uptake is really ramped up, and so it gets closer to those perennials, but still the perennials are much lower. And then again, as part of the SARE project, Adam Janke and a crew of students and some staff with Iowa Learning Farms went out and did some bird surveys. And so one of the things that they were looking at in some of these established areas was just simply what species of greatest conservation need were we finding in them. And as you can go down that list, there's a lot of species of conservation need that do show up in these CP23 native mixed species there. And so while we don't catch them all, we do start to see them coming into these areas. And so that's a conservation benefit that we're gaining from these. And then, like all of them, we do have suggested resources or additional resources that participants can really dive into and find more information depending on the type of questions that they're being asked or they have an interest in. And so that's a nice way to kind of get people in there to find some really good, some really credible information to supplement with. So again, we got the booklets for the educators, the students, and the additional information. And just to sound like an infomercial here, this is a case study where we've got some added value that the other ones don't. So I talked about one of the farmers or farmer situations that's included with the main materials here, but this case study has 3 additional farmer situations that we are able to highlight. And again, it's because of that funding through the North Central SARE program that we're able to do this. And so now you can start to look at some of the unique differences from one farm to the next, because this case study does really highlight 4 different farmers and the unique situations that they have. Most of the case studies do have course agendas, and I'm not really going to get into that. I just wanted to highlight that those are available. And this probably comes in a little bit more handy for the more formal instruction at high school or at the college level. And then at the high school level, we've dug in and we do have some of those core standards set up through the state of Iowa, right? So how do these case studies help meet those core standards and which ones? And so that's a easier way to be able to jump in and help those high school instructors be able to add this into their curriculum a little bit. And then like the other case studies, again, we do have some example questions that we can start to explore and assess, student learning outcomes there, right? So I'm just highlighting two here from kind of a farm level, just asking them to use the nutrient tracking tool results that are provided, and to have them estimate the nutrient and sediment loss reductions that they might see on their own fields that they've been assigned to. Or another question is what management and machinery considerations do we need to take into account if we're establishing and maintaining perennial vegetation? And this really gets to establishing these perennial species. Most of them are very small seeded, much smaller than even the small grains or the corn and soybeans that we're used to planting in these row cropped areas, right? And so some farmers may not have that experience, or that experience goes back, 15, 20, 25 years, something like that. And so this question really dives into what are some of the considerations that we need to take into account for that. And then some questions that do jump into at the watershed level. So again, what type of challenges or barriers do we have of converting this marginal farmland into perennial vegetation, right? Is there targeted areas that work better than others, so on and so forth. And then kind of bring in some of the sociological aspects of it, right? So how do we convince farmers or landowners to convert marginal land into perennial vegetation? It's not as straightforward as some of the other management practices that farmers and landowners are really considering and trying to make. So the last slide here, just kind of talking about how do we add this into curriculum? Well, the first thing is knowing where to find it. So you can go onto the Conservation Learning Group's webpage, and as you scroll down and kind of into that lower left column, you'll find these case studies and a link that will take you to where you can download the information out of them. So feel free to jump in and download these case studies, explore them, think of ways that you can insert them into your classrooms or into your farmer field days, things like that. I do think that a lot of this is going to be very applied type of courses or workshops where these fit in. I do think they fit, all the way down to the high school level, all the way up to working with growers, working with watershed groups and things like that, in a very applied way, getting them to think about, situations where these can very well fit. Obviously, we've done a lot of work to design these so they do fit into that high school science or ag courses, community colleges, undergraduate, graduate level courses at various colleges and universities. And so I do think there is some pretty good use in those type of situations as well. Okay, so at this point, I am gonna open it up for questions. And while you're either typing in those questions or formulating them, I do wanna show our certified crop advisor credits and how you can go about that. Just make sure you get those to Liz Ripley by the end of today. And there's that information. And I'll come back to this slide in a second. I do want to also show here real quickly a preview of our next webinar. And so it's Andrea Bosch with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, talking about treating cover crops like a cash crop, strategies and opportunities. And so that should be a really good one. Andrea has a connection to Iowa State and has been doing cover crop research. Well, it goes back into her graduate school days. So she's got a lot of experience and exposure there. So it should be a really good webinar. Okay, back to the CEUs, and I'll open it up, Matt, if you have some questions already.
We do have some questions, Mark. Okay, first, what different species are included in the CP23 seed mix?
Oh, that's a great question. And I will have to pull it up. So I know it's got like 25 to 30 different species in it. It has a lot of warm seasons, so like big blue stem, Indian grass. I think there's some little blue stem in it. And then there's a whole host of forbs, or those broadleaf flowering type of species in it. And there's different types of CP23 mixes as well, right? So there's for hydric soils, there's some for flood prone soils, and then there's some for more of the, they term it as mesic, but not quite as wet, but still on the wetter side.
Okay. You had any thoughts or discussions about these marginal areas being used for agroforestry? And if they flood often, might that preclude it in some way?
That's a really good question for Billy Beck or some of our state foresters. Just my personal exposure or knowledge in that area would say you're probably going to be limited on species of trees that you can put there, right? So like most species, they either like, flood prone wet soils, or they don't. and that's probably where I would stop with it. But there could potentially be something there. I know when we started out with this North Central SARE project, we were open to using more of the grazing or species that we might take for hay cuttings, right? In this situation, the areas were a little bit smaller, and the farmers really didn't want to mess with kind of the grazing or haying options there. But that's another option. But again, we're going to have some limitation on which species are going to work in some of these wetter areas.
Okay. And Liz has put links in to where you can find this information that Mark was talking about, the curriculum, case studies, and so forth, and have time for some more questions. So feel free to type those in if you have them. But we did have another one that, Mark, any of your case studies include organic matter infiltration or aggregate stability to this point?
So I know that this case study does not, what we showed there was the vegetation assessment, the soil nitrates. The infield one, I think we maybe talk about some of that a little bit, but I don't think I know we did not take a lot of data collection to supplement into that. We would have been using research articles, things like that, to reinforce those, I'll call them soil health type of parameters.
I don't know if this is similar from what you've seen in some of our work with prairie. That first indicator that we've seen change has been that aggregate stability.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? These perennial species do a really good job of putting out root mass. So it's building that porosity, it's building that aggregate stability. And so kind of along with aggregate stability, it's also providing some of that infiltration structure, right? So that's where we see those infiltration rates build up fairly quickly as well.
So, okay, management question. What does the management look like for helping the favorable native species get well established in the first couple of years?
Yeah, and so this is some work that Adam Jenke really spearheaded from the standpoint of working with some conservation biologists that are a little bit more experienced with establishing these native mixes. And so part of it is just having to recognize that they are smaller seeded. And so a lot of these, as Adam would say, is you seed them like nature seeds them, right? And so you do want and you do need seed to soil contact, but getting them on the soil surface or, at, an eighth to a quarter inch depth is more than enough as far as getting them seeded, right? Part of the issue is keeping some of those non-desirables from out competing them, right? And so that's where kind of that establishment management comes into play, and we really do have to focus on. So we do need to, in the establishment year, maybe even the second year, we do need to go out and we need to probably do some high mowing. So, mow at a height of 6 inches, just to keep some of those desirables down and letting light and resources into the species that we're trying to get established. But again, just kind of set your expectations too, right? You're not going to get these to establish very quickly. They just don't do that. Some of it's a hard seed issue. Some of it is, we're just not breeding them for quick establishment, right? And, a lot of these species are native, and so there's not any breeding done to them. And so we just have to set the expectations that it's going to take a year or two to really get them to take off. And, in some cases, the species in those places are going to evolve over, a 5 to 10 year period as well. And so just having to understand some of those dynamics that are occurring as well. So Matt, I do have a couple questions that came into mind.
Great.
And so one of the questions was, which program did we use to measure that profit loss on the fields? And so in our project, we were using Ag Leader's SMS program. So especially if you have spatial data, it captures all of that. And then you can go in and you can talk about the cost per unit of fertilizer or cost per unit of seed. You can assign commodity price. And so then it can do that on again, if you're doing a lot of variable rate, it's able to do that quite easily across the field, and it takes into account the yield maps. There are some other programs out there. I'm just not familiar with them. So again, if this is something that you're working with, if you have SMS from Ag Leader available, it's a good resource, but don't feel like you have to be limited to that one. And then the other question was about the price of fertilizer or lack thereof. How might this might make it more attractive? Yeah, definitely. If you're, anytime you have, and you're talking about cost of production, some of the things that are on the higher end of that cost of production list. So your fertilizer and your seed, right? If those are higher costs, that's going to bring down your profit. And so those do impact it. And then the other part of what impacts that profit loss is just what are the commodity prices. And right now where we're north of $6, north of $13 on corn and beans, that's going to change that ratio a little bit as well. And so you do have to factor that in and think about what's going to work and what's not going to work.
Was a question here, Mark. What about cropping history to qualify for CRP? If any area has flooded multiple times, there may not be a 5-year cropping history.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. A lot of times we do, because there's the CRP program, but there's other cost share programs that you might be able to jump into. So I would encourage you to kind of get into the NRCS office, FSA office, and talk to them and see what programs might fit. Just because those offices may not have a program, don't count out groups like Pheasants Forever, because they do at times have some cost share to help with the seed cost or the establishment cost. So it may be a one-time, so to speak, up front cost sharing versus, the land payment on the long term.
And especially for this type of thing where those areas may not be profitable, if we could just get help with the seeding, we're still going to be in the long run, more profitable, because we're not continually putting inputs and not getting enough return out of some of these acres.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Even without something like a CRP program.
Yeah.
Right. Those are the questions I had, Mark. Do you have any others there?
I do not have any others that have came into me.
Thank you so much, Mark, for leading this effort and for the case study. And I think, like you said, this one has a little bit more than maybe some of the others with, kind of the individual farmer pieces of information. So I think they could be really useful. Again, if you need a CCA CEU, get that to Liz Ripley, ejukums@iastate.edu today. And then hopefully we'll see many of you next week for talking about cover crops. And we get Andrea over at least on virtually, from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So with that, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and thanks for tuning into the webinar this week. Thanks, Mark.